There is a particular quality of silence in an old-growth redwood forest. Sound doesn't carry the way it does elsewhere. It's absorbed by the thick, spongy bark, the deep duff of the forest floor, the perpetual coastal fog that hangs in the canopy 300 feet overhead. Standing among trees that were already ancient when the Roman Empire fell, it is easy to imagine that this place has always been exactly as it is now, timeless, untouched, eternal. But that impression is an illusion, and in some ways it is the central deception of the Redwood Coast. The forest we walk through today is not the forest that stood here 2 centuries ago. 90% of the original old growth was cut down within a single human lifetime. The quiet groves that visitors now treat as sanctuaries were, for the people who lived here for thousands of years, home, and then, abruptly and violently, they were not. The story of this land is not a gentle one. It is a story of reverence and catastrophe, of a landscape that was loved in 2 completely incompatible ways, and of a park that exists today only because of a century-long fight that nobody entirely won. This is the real history beneath the tourist brochures, richer, stranger, and more haunting than any ghost story. Long before there was a Redwood National Park, before there was a California, before there was a United States, there were people living among these trees. The archaeological record is startling in its depth. Excavations near the Smith River, in territory long inhabited by the Tolowa, have revealed human presence dating back at least 8,500 years. Other estimates for the broader region reach back 3,000 years for continuous village occupation. But the deeper record suggests people have known this coast for the better part of 10 millennia. Several distinct peoples made their homes in and around what is now the park, each with its own language, identity, and relationship to the land. The land, comprising Redwood National and State Parks, has been inhabited for thousands of years by diverse indigenous nations, including the Yurok, Tolowa, Chilula, and Wiyot. These were not a single culture, but a mosaic of communities, speaking mutually unintelligible languages and maintaining distinct traditions, bound together by a shared dependence on the extraordinary abundance of the Redwood Coast. The geography of settlement followed the land's own logic. The Chilula settled primarily along the Redwood Creek Valley, while the Tolowa inhabited areas near the Smith River. The Yurok, who would prove to be the most numerous, built their world along the lower Klamath River and the coast where it meets the sea. The Tolowa, Yurok, Chilula, Wiyot, and Karak all had strong historical ties to the region, but the Yurok apparently outnumbered the other tribes. The scale of their presence was considerable. An 1852 census determined that the Yurok were the most numerous, with 55 villages and an estimated population of 2,500. These were not people passing lightly through the landscape. They were builders, engineers, and craftspeople who had figured out how to turn the largest trees on Earth into homes, boats, and villages. They used the abundant redwood, which with its linear grain was easily split into planks, as a building material for boats, houses, and small villages. The construction technique was sophisticated. For buildings, the planks would be erected side by side in a narrow trench, with the upper portions bound with leather strapping and held by notches cut into the supporting roof beams, and redwood boards were used to form a shallow sloping roof. Crucially, they generally did not fell the living giants. They worked with fallen trees, splitting planks from trunks that the forest itself had brought down. Fallen redwood logs were used to build plank houses, which were not only homes, but held spiritual significance as gifts from sacred beings. The way of life these structures supported was one of remarkable balance. Prior to European contact, these communities thrived through fishing the abundant rivers, hunting elk and deer, and gathering plants in a sustainable balance with nature. The salmon runs of the Klamath were the beating heart of the Yurok economy, drawing the community together twice a year in a rhythm that structured the entire calendar. And the people actively managed the landscape rather than simply living on top of it. Traditional ecological knowledge, including the practice of controlled cultural burning, was used to manage the landscape, keeping oak woodlands healthy and preventing destructive wildfires. This is a detail worth pausing on. The pristine wilderness that European settlers believed they had discovered was in fact a carefully tended landscape, shaped over thousands of years by deliberate human stewardship. To understand what was later lost, you have to understand that for the indigenous peoples of this coast, the redwoods were never merely lumber. They were something closer to kin. The relationship was spiritual as much as material, and the two could not be separated. As one scholar has framed it, the connection ran deeper than the wood itself. Scholar Gail L. Jenner notes that their lives were and are built on more than just wood. Although the redwood was the source of much of their material culture, their lives were enmeshed in the very character and fabric of the trees. The trees were understood as sacred, living, watchful presences. To the Yurok, the trees are sacred living beings which stand as guardians over sacred places. Nowhere was this expressed more powerfully than in the words of Minnie Reeves, a Chilula elder and religious leader whose testimony has become one of the most cited expressions of the Redwood Coast's indigenous cosmology. As noted by Minnie Reeves in 1976, the Chilula are people from within the redwood tree. For Reeves, the trees were not a resource but a message, a physical demonstration of divine love, and a warning. Reeves elaborated that the trees are a gift from the Creator as a demonstration of love. Destroy these trees and you destroy the Creator's love. And if you destroy that which the Creator loves so much, you will eventually destroy mankind. She returned to this theme across the years, and her words have been preserved as something like scripture for the region. In 1981, Minnie Reeves, an elder and spiritual leader of the Chilula people, shared the significance of the redwoods. The redwood trees are sacred. They are a special gift and reminder from the great Creator to the human beings. There is a terrible prophecy embedded in Reeves's testimony, given that she was speaking in the aftermath of the very destruction she warned against. By the time she spoke these words in the 1970s and 1980s, the overwhelming majority of the ancient forest, the physical body of the Creator's gift, had already been cut down. She was describing a covenant that had, in the eyes of many, already been broken. The intimacy of the bond is captured in that single Chilula phrase, people from within the redwood tree. The Chilula did not live near the redwoods or among them. Until the 1860s, the Chilula lived in the middle region of the Redwood Creek Valley in close company with the redwood trees. They understood themselves as having emerged from the trees, as belonging to them in the most literal sense a people can belong to a place. The first contact was fleeting. The first Europeans likely visited the coast near the parks in 1543. For more than 2 centuries afterward, the Redwood Coast remained largely beyond the reach of European ambition, too remote, too foggy, too forbidding. Later, explorers like Bruno de Heceta and Juan Francisco de la Bodega y Cuadra anchored near a Yurok village in 1775. These early encounters left the indigenous world essentially intact. The dark, dense forests did not invite settlement. To European eyes, they seemed less like paradise than like an obstacle. When the first European explorers encountered the region, the dark, dense forests seemed forbidding. Overland exploration came later still. In 1828, Jedediah Smith was one of the first European explorers to travel through the redwood forests inland, a name that would later be attached, with some irony, to one of the state parks carved out to protect the very trees his arrival helped open to exploitation. For nearly 300 years after that first sighting in 1543, the indigenous peoples of the Redwood Coast lived much as they always had. And then, in the space of a single decade, their world was shattered. The turning point was gold. By the 1850s, the California gold rush brought outsiders to the area in droves, who quickly displaced the Native Americans that had been making their homes here since time immemorial. The change was not gradual, and it was not gentle. It arrived as an invasion. This is the part of the history that the tourist brochures tend to soften into a single sentence about displacement, and it deserves to be stated plainly. The arrival of settlers, miners, and militias brought not just dispossession, but organized violence. Native communities were forcibly displaced, faced violence, and experienced massacres at the hands of militias. The peoples who had tended this coast for 8,000 years were killed, driven from their villages, and stripped of the land that formed the core of their identity. And then came a second betrayal, quieter but with consequences that echo into the present day. Even the legal instruments meant to offer some protection were deliberately sabotaged. Despite treaties, lobbying by the California delegation prevented the establishment of federal reservations, leaving tribes without treaty protections, which continues to impact their legal rights today. Treaties were negotiated and then, through political maneuvering, never ratified, leaving the tribes of Northern California in a legal limbo whose effects have never fully resolved. This was not an accident of history. It was a choice. made by people who wanted the land and the resources on it, and who found the continued legal existence of the original inhabitants inconvenient. By the 1860s, the physical infrastructure of the Old World was being erased. The Chilula presence in the Redwood Creek Valley, continuous for uncounted generations, was broken. Village sites were abandoned, overrun, or destroyed. When a National Park Service surveyor visited the region more than a century later to catalog what remained, the record he found was already fragmentary. Located within Redwood National Park are a number of Yurok, 2 Tolowa, and 2 Chilula village sites. But at some, such as Oreku, the remains had been obliterated by a sawmill. That single detail, a sawmill built directly atop an ancient village, grinding its remains into nothing, is perhaps the most complete image of what happened here. The machinery of the new economy did not merely displace the old world, it was often erected on its physical grave. If the 1850s brought catastrophe to the people, the decades that followed brought it to the trees. The same qualities that had made the redwoods sacred to the Chilula made them irresistible to the timber industry. They were enormous, the wood was durable and rot-resistant, and there were, at first, seemingly endless quantities of it. The scale of the original forest is almost impossible to picture now. Of the original 2 million acres of old-growth redwood forest, only a small fraction would survive. 2 million acres of trees, some of them more than 350 feet tall and 2,000 years old, blanketing the coastal mountains in an unbroken canopy. The demand that consumed them was driven by California's own explosive growth. The push began after the 1850 gold rush, which brought an influx of Euro-American settlers, miners, and commercial loggers. Driven by demand for durable lumber, timber operations rapidly decimated the ancient forests. The destruction accelerated over time rather than slowing, because the technology kept improving. What had once required immense human labor became faster and more efficient with each passing decade. World War II and the building boom of the 1950s accelerated the logging in Northern California, and by the 1960s, 90% of the old-growth redwoods were gone. The post-war housing boom was especially devastating. A nation building suburbs at breakneck speed had an insatiable appetite for lumber, and the ancient redwoods fed it. Following World War II, logging rates boomed again in response to accelerated construction, and more advanced equipment, including motorized drag saws, and companies began to move from selective cutting toward clear cutting so that thousands of acres of privately held virgin old growth was logged. That shift from selective cutting to clear cutting mattered enormously. Selective logging removes individual trees and leaves the forest standing. Clear cutting takes everything, leaving behind a landscape that observers at the time compared to the aftermath of war. Whole mountainsides were stripped bare. The soil, no longer held by roots, washed into the salmon streams. Within roughly a century of the gold rush, the great forest that had stood for millions of years was very nearly gone. The conservation movement was, in a sense, a race against the saw, and for most of its history, it was losing. The first organized efforts arose at the turn of the 20th century, as a handful of scientists and nature lovers began to grasp the speed of what was happening. Logging of the old-growth forests eventually led to conservation efforts culminating in the establishment of the Semper Virens Club in 1900 and later, the Save the Redwoods League in 1917. The league, founded by members of the Boone and Crockett Club, would become the central institution in the century-long struggle to preserve the redwoods. In 1918, members of the Boone and Crockett Club founded the Save the Redwoods League, dedicated to protecting what remained of these giant trees. The league's early strategy was philanthropic rather than political. Rather than fighting the timber companies directly, it raised money to buy redwood groves outright and turn them over to public ownership. This group of wealthy businessmen raised the money to buy tracts of old-growth forest, the state of California offered matching funds, and 4 state parks were created. Those early acquisitions established the first protected redwood lands. The league raised money to purchase redwood groves and, working with the state of California, helped create 4 state parks within a decade: Jedediah Smith Redwoods, Del Norte Coast Redwoods, Prairie Creek Redwoods, and Humboldt Redwoods. Between 1920 and 1960, the league steadily expanded its holdings, acquiring an additional 100,000 acres. But philanthropy could not keep pace with industrial clear-cutting, and the 2 world wars repeatedly interrupted the effort. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, the Save the Redwoods League continued its efforts, but with U.S. involvement in World War II and then the Cold War, the League was unable to accomplish much. Every year the League spent raising money to buy a grove was a year in which a dozen other groves fell to the saw. By the early 1960s, it was clear that a piecemeal approach would not be enough. The movement needed something bigger, a national park, backed by the power and the purse of the federal government. In 1961, the Save the Redwoods League joined forces with the long-established Sierra Club and the National Geographic Society to revive the idea for a Redwood National Park. What followed was one of the most contentious conservation battles in American history, and it grew far beyond the borders of California. The creation of a Redwood National Park was a global movement, with supporters all over the United States, Europe, and even China. The fight came to a head in the halls of Congress. The movement came to a head in 1967, when a bill that would establish a Redwood National Park was presented to the United States Congress, and in April of 1967, the Subcommittee on Parks and Recreation held public hearings. The testimony from those hearings still resonates. Ralph Cheney, the president of the Save the Redwoods League, tried to convey to the lawmakers the true scale of what was at stake, not in dollars, but in deep time. He told the subcommittee, "I want to add only one point and speak in terms of 100 million. Not $100 million, but 100 million years. For that is the time that trees like our coast redwoods have lived in North America." The obstacle was money and the peculiar problem of ownership. Most national parks had been carved from land the government already controlled. The redwoods were different. One of the hurdles was that in the past, land already in government ownership was turned into national parks. But for the redwoods, most of the land slated for a park was privately owned. The government would have to buy the forest from the timber companies that owned it, companies that were, at that very moment, racing to cut those trees before any law could stop them. The politics were brutal, and they pitted two communities against each other in a way that still shapes the region. New and improved technologies meant loggers could work faster than ever, so the industry boomed, while a new, dedicated environmental movement grew partly in response to the rapid decline of old-growth forests. Not surprisingly, the two communities opposed each other. For the timber towns of the North Coast, the park threatened livelihoods, jobs, and a whole way of life. For the conservationists, every delay meant irreplaceable loss. There was no compromise that could fully satisfy both. Even the president's support could not speed things through. Even though President Lyndon Johnson was in favor of a new park, Congress wanted more meetings and compromise. But finally, after roughly 50 years of effort since the League's founding, the bill became law. Despite resistance from lumber companies, 58,000 acres became a national park on October 2, 1968. The creation of Redwood National Park is often told as a triumph, the moment the trees were finally saved. The truth is considerably more painful, and it is here that the celebratory version of the story falls apart. By the time the park was established, the thing it was meant to protect had largely already been destroyed. The 1968 boundaries were the product of political compromise, not ecological logic, and the result was a park that made little sense on the ground. Neither the Sierra Club nor the Save the Redwoods League were satisfied with the results. A strangely shaped park that protected old growth from logging, but not from erosion caused by uphill logging projects. The park protected certain groves while leaving the watersheds above them exposed, so that clear-cutting on adjacent land sent mudslides and debris pouring down into the supposedly protected forest below. Worse, much of what was folded into the park was not pristine forest at all, but the wreckage left behind by the logging companies. When Congress created Redwood National Park in 1968 and expanded it in 1978, more than half of Redwood Creek's 40,000 acres of virgin redwood had already been clear-cut. The cut-over land looked like a war zone and was incorporated into the park. The nation paid an extraordinary sum for the privilege. The total cost of Redwood National Park was $1.6 billion, a vastly inflated sum for what remains the most expensive national park in U.S. history. Americans paid a fortune in large part for land that had already been stripped, buying back devastation at the price of treasure. The inadequacy of the original boundaries became obvious almost immediately, and it forced a second act. Within a year, research showed that logging on the park's borders was damaging it, and that more land had to be acquired to better protect it. That research led to a major expansion in 1978 and to a shift in the conservation movement's whole philosophy. The Save the Redwoods League moved towards supporting government intervention to save the redwoods rather than the strict focus on individual philanthropy it had traditionally maintained through its Memorial Grove program. Even after the park's creation, the broader war over the redwoods was not over. The most dramatic confrontations were still to come, as a new generation of activists turned to direct action. In the 1980s, radical environmentalists began literally climbing into the ancient trees to stop the saws. Activists staged tree sits, hoisting themselves onto small plywood platforms, dangling 150 feet above the ground in ancient redwoods measuring 13 feet in diameter at the base. These campaigns were desperate, and mostly they failed. Nearly every grove that activists occupied and agitated to preserve got cut down or severely damaged, with the notable exception of Headwaters Forest, whose survival one longtime activist called nothing short of a miracle. Walk the Berry Glen Trail today and you can still feel the strangeness of this place. The redwoods here are genetically among the most diverse in the world, and that diversity produces trees of bizarre, almost unsettling appearance, trunks warped and scarred and swollen into shapes that have earned them nicknames from the people who know them. The forest can look, in the fog, like something out of a dream or a nightmare. It is no wonder that ghost stories cling to these groves. A landscape this ancient, this quiet, and this scarred by loss seems to demand them. But the real haunting of Redwood National Park is not supernatural. It is historical. It lives in the abandoned village sites where the Chilula, people from within the redwood tree, lived for thousands of years before being driven out in a single violent decade. It lives in the sawmill built atop the ruins of Oreku. It lives in the 90% of the ancient forest that no longer exists, a vast absence that no visitor can see precisely because it is gone. When you stand in an old-growth grove and marvel at its cathedral silence, you are standing in the surviving 10%, a fragment of a world that was almost entirely erased. And yet the story does not end in loss, which is perhaps its most surprising turn. The people who were supposed to have been swept aside did not vanish. The descendants of these indigenous people still live in the surrounding areas and beyond, and several of their traditional languages, including Tolowa, Yurok, Hoopa, and Karuk, are still kept alive in community today, along with ritual traditions and other important parts of these ancient ways of life. The languages that colonization tried to extinguish are being deliberately revived. The revival of the Tolowa, Yurok, Hoopa, and Karuk languages is growing as younger generations learn and keep these languages alive. More than that, the descendants of the original inhabitants are once again helping to steward the land their ancestors tended for 8,000 years. Tribal councils now work closely with Redwood National and state parks in programs like habitat restoration, condor reintroduction, archaeological site protection, and prescribed fire use, blending traditional knowledge with modern practices. That last item, prescribed fire, is quietly remarkable. The very practice of controlled cultural burning that indigenous peoples used to manage this landscape for millennia, suppressed and outlawed for a century, is now being restored as cutting-edge ecological science. The reclamation extends even to the sea. In 2023, 3 local Native American tribes created the Yurok, Tolowa, Dini Indigenous Marine Stewardship Area, protecting 700 square miles of ocean waters and coastline. After nearly 2 centuries of dispossession, the original peoples of this coast are formally reasserting their role as its guardians. The redwoods teach a strange lesson about time. A coast redwood can live more than 2,000 years. The oldest trees standing in the park today were seedlings around the time the Roman Republic was giving way to empire. Against that span, the entire drama of this history, the arrival of strangers, the massacres, the near total destruction of the forest, the long fight to save its remnants, occupies a startlingly thin slice. Roughly 90% of old-growth redwood timber was logged between the gold rush and the 1960s, barely more than a century, a single ring's width in the life of an ancient tree. That is the real mystery of Redwood National Park, and it is far more affecting than any legend of a hooded figure on a foggy trail. It is the mystery of how much can be lost so quickly and how much can survive despite everything. The trees that remain are survivors of a catastrophe. The people who tend them are survivors of a catastrophe, and the forest, quiet and vast and older than memory, keeps its own counsel, holding in its silence a history far heavier than most who walk beneath it will ever know. Many Reeves warned that to destroy these trees would be to destroy the Creator's love, and to destroy the Creator's love would be to destroy mankind. Most of the trees were destroyed, that the warning did not fully come to pass, that a fragment of the forest and the people who love it endured, is the closest thing this haunted, beautiful, wounded landscape offers to grace. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. This has been National Park Mysteries.